Come learn the good, the bad, and the ugly about genetic ancestry testing and race and uses in Star Trek, starting now. Hello, my name is Mohammed Noor. I'm a biology professor at Duke University, and I'm an occasional science consultant for the Star Trek universe. I'm very excited to talk with you today about genetic ancestry testing. So I'm going to talk about its usefulness, but I'm also going to give you a lot of cautions about how it may not be telling you what you think it's telling you. And I'll talk about the social concept of race, and all of this will be framed using our favorite series, Star Trek. This is going to be a little bit different from some of my other videos in that this is a full-length convention talk. By the time you're watching this, I hopefully will have already given it at a few conventions. If you missed seeing it live, this is your chance to still see it. So without further ado, let's dive right in. So again, the title of my talk is Genetics, Ancestry, Race, and Star Trek. So my goals are going to be to introduce some simple genetics and evolution concepts to you. Then I'm going to use those concepts to talk about direct-to-consumer genetics ancestry testing and how that works. Now that's going to sound straightforward, but I'm going to tell you about some interpretation challenges with those results, and specifically how what you get may not mean what you think it means. And finally, I'll use that to talk about cultural perceptions of race. I'd like to do all of this with some references to our favorite fandom, Star Trek. Woohoo! Now, as many of you know, I'm a geneticist. Now, genetics is really, really cool. It's literally a code in every cell of your body that affects how you look, it affects how you feel, it affects what diseases you're likely to get, it affects how long you live, and a whole lot more. So when I'm sitting on a plane and I'm talking to the person next to me and say I'm a geneticist, I often get an ooh, ah. But what do we see about genetics in sci-fi, and Star Trek in particular? Well, it's not always so good. We have these genetically engineered superhumans, we have engineered super soldiers, we have bad viruses and mutations. I mean, think about it. Who are the good geneticists that you see in Star Trek? I can really only think of one, and that's Carol Marcus from Wrath of Khan. And of course, when they rebooted that movie, they made her an engineer. Ugh. But genetics is really cool, and understanding it does help us know a lot more about ourselves. So let me give you a primer on some basic genetics and inheritance before we start. DNA. DNA is the hereditary material found in all life on Earth. Stretches of DNA that contain a message like make hair color brown are called genes, and genes are packaged together in long threads called chromosomes. We humans have 23 pairs of such chromosomes, and we get one copy of each pair from our genetic mom and one copy of each pair from our genetic dad. All together, this forms what we call our genome. Now, these terms do come up in Star Trek. So this figure is showing an analysis I made of the proportion of episodes from each of the early Star Trek series that use the words DNA, genetic, or genome. So looking at the original series, there's almost no reference to any of these terms. But it makes sense for the time. Scientists literally had not even sequenced DNA yet when the original series ended in 1969. As we go to the next generation, Deep Space Nine and Voyager in the 1990s, the Human Genome Project is in full swing, and we see a lot more references to these terms. Now with Enterprise, the first draft human genome sequence had been published, and again, a big step up in usage of those words. So overall, usage of genetics terms in the various series match what is the state of the science at the time. And that continues to be true with new Trek like Star Trek Discovery. I just don't talk about that here because episodes are still coming out. But back to DNA, we all have it, but it's not identical in everyone. Now, why is that? Well, the reason is, of course, because of mutations. Now, these affect not just why individuals differ, but also why populations differ. I'm going to come back to that in just a second, but one thing I want to stress, this next slide does not show a likely outcome of mutations. Now, there are lots of reasons. There's the predictability of changes, having the exact same changes in multiple people, and more. I talk about this episode more in one of my other videos linked to here as a suggested video. Anyway, let's talk about mutations and evolution. So let's imagine a population of individuals. So for simplicity, let's say that each person has just one copy of every gene, and I'm showing a stretch of DNA from that one gene now. So altogether, this is showing an ancestral population that is homogeneous. Everyone has the same sequence of DNA letters, right? Now let's say that this population gets split into two, perhaps by a river that crosses through the middle. Now we're going to zoom in just on the left side first. So this is now showing just the folks on the left side, and again, they're still all the same. But after a few generations, say 21 or so, maybe a mutation pops up that makes that last letter an A in one individual. And maybe just by chance, that mutation may start to spread. The bearer just randomly has a few more kids than average. And after a few more generations, maybe A is still getting more abundant, and eventually, just by chance, a lot of people have it. But then this other mutation pops up, this green T. Now, look at the overall left population now. There are changes from how it started in many, but not all individuals, but there's also variation among these individuals within the population. So let's jump over to the other side of the river and see what's happening there. Now, here we see a different mutation has popped up, this blue G at the start. This is not a mutation that popped up in the left population. It's unique to the right population. So that one maybe spreads over time, and maybe this purple C also pops up. Now, let's compare these two final populations. So look at them. If you got a DNA sequence from one of these people shown here, you can pretty well tell if they came from the left side of the river or the right side of the river just by looking at their DNA, right? Well, that's what will happen in a lab. They'd get a DNA sample, they'd look at the DNA, and they'd infer which population the sample came from. Now, it's not 100% diagnostic, but it's pretty good, pretty accurate. Now, this is especially true if you look at a lot of genes. Now, let's talk for a second about lots of genes. Because interestingly, not every gene will tell you the same story. Now let me show you why. Now I'm showing here the whole chromosome. And remember, everyone has two copies, one from their genetic mom and one from their genetic dad. So genetic mom here is on the top left, genetic dad at the top right. And if mom gives a red copy of the chromosome and dad gives a blue copy of the chromosome, then the daughter inherits one of each. But what does she pass on, this daughter? Interestingly, rather than passing on a whole red or a whole blue chromosome to her kids, she might pass along a chromosome with pieces of each. So copies of chromosomes swap such pieces, and that makes new combinations. And that's why we call this process recombination. Now I talk about this in another one of my other videos too, so you can see a little bit more depth over there. Now, this new combination gets put into one of her eggs, and in fact, her different eggs will have different combinations. Now, this is just one of the reasons that not all kids from the same parents look exactly the same as each other. Now, because of this, different genes may have different histories. Now, let's look at this across all chromosomes. So here are 22 of your 23 pairs of chromosomes. Now, I'm skipping the X and Y chromosomes for simplicity because that adds a complication. Now, this purpley blue color on the slide and in the next ones indicate your DNA. So unsurprisingly, all of your chromosome pairs have your DNA. Now, let's look at your DNA as it sits in your mother. Okay, now she'd have given you one of each of her pairs of chromosomes, designated by these numbers, but the pieces may not be contiguous inside her since they got shuffled by recombination as she made the egg that made you. Now you can see where the recombination events happened. Now, let's look at generations further back. Now we see grandparents, great-grandparents, etc. Now, not only are we seeing that less DNA overall matches you, but the individual stretches that match you are also smaller and smaller. When we go out to 6 generations, there's just tiny bits that made it into you. I'll come back to this in just a little while. But that intro to genetics is a good lead-in for talking about genetics ancestry testing. For direct-to-consumer ancestry testing from DNA, you get this small tube like this, and you spit a ton into it. And I have to tell you, it's a lot harder than it sounds, just making that much spit. You then mail the tube off to a company, these are 2 examples, and they isolate the DNA from your spit. Then, using molecular biology and computational tools, they infer some of your DNA letters. Now again, you have one set from your mom and one from your dad, and sometimes these are not identical. Also, there's a lot more than this little stretch of DNA. You have 3.1 billion letters rather than 18. And the DNA letters in your sample get compared to databases with thousands of samples from people from literally all over the world. By comparing your DNA sample to samples from these different populations, the companies can say that your genes are a close match and likely come from these populations in the distant past. And they look at maybe 500,000 or more spots in the genome that they know are variable to get an idea where different parts of your genome may have come from. So let's look at an example. This is mine. Now, I have to say mine is not the most interesting, but I have permission to share it. Now, these are 5 of my chromosomes. Unsurprisingly, most of my genome has Egyptian ancestry. That's the light purple. But we also see this one stretch on chromosome 7 that appears to be of Italian descent, and this other stretch on chromosome 7 that appears to be of Nigerian descent. But for me, it's all still Africa, Middle East, Mediterranean. Now, instead, let me look at a friend of mine who looks a little bit more interesting. This friend is from South America. You can see here he has a large percentage of Spanish and Portuguese ancestry, and also a fair bit of Native American. Now, that's really not uncommon for South America. Now, we can look at his individual chromosomes. The blue here is the Spanish and Portuguese, and the yellow is the Native American. We see lots of little pieces all mixed up, as you see, and trace bits that may be from elsewhere. Now, this sort of ancestry testing is something people have a lot of fun playing with. And, they try to link this up to stories and family connections. I'm going to come back to that in a minute because that's fraught. But there's another function of these ancestry tests in that they can help you find relatives. I did this, and I was very surprised that it linked me up with someone here in the United States. Now, 23andMe said this person was a likely third cousin. What I did is I traded family trees with this person, and it turns out she's a third cousin once removed. You can see the areas of perfect match here, but pretty amazing, right? Now, so far, all these uses have been real-life examples, but let's turn for just a moment to Star Trek. So in the Enterprise episode E Squared, there was an interesting discussion between Dr. Phlox, Captain Archer, and Vulcan T'Pol. This is a cosplayer of T'Pol here. Now, they had just met 2 people, one woman named Karen Archer, and a man who is half Vulcan named Lorian. So I'll read an excerpt here from what Phlox says. They are who they claim to be. Most of the young woman's ancestors were human, but there are also chromosomes from 3 species I've never seen before. These genetic markers belong to you, Captain. She would appear to be your great-granddaughter. Then turning to T'Pol, I've compared your genetic profile with Lorian's. These base pair sequences could only have come from you. So you see in this episode, there's several accurate uses of genetic tests. We have species ancestry testing, we have relative testing, we have parentage testing. Now in the case of Karen Archer, presumably Phlox saw a perfect match with about 1/8 of Jonathan Archer's genome. And Karen shares half with her mom, 1/4 with her grandmother, and then 1/8 with Jonathan on average. So that works pretty well. Now, the comment about chromosomes from 3 species Phlox has never seen before is a good segue to the next use. And this is something you probably don't think about in the context of humans. It's not like we have any alien ancestry. We definitely don't, by the way. However, most of us, surprisingly, are not pure human. Non-Africans tend to have noticeable pieces of Neanderthal genetic ancestry. And some other ancient hominids may also contribute to some modern people, like the extinct Denisovan peoples. And again, some companies will tell you your fraction of Neanderthal DNA. Here's mine as an example. Now, species testing is definitely something that happened in Star Trek. Not just an example I showed you, but here's another great example. And this one is from Voyager in the early season. Seska, who looks Bajoran, is talking with Chakotay. So I'm showing the 2 actors here. Now I'll read the script and I'll make different voices to distinguish the 2 people talking. So to Chakotay's first. What would you say I owe to a Cardassian who infiltrated my crew? What are you talking about? Isn't that why you never got around to a blood analysis when we came on board? I didn't get around to it because I didn't get around to it. Turns out your blood is missing all the common Bajoran blood factors. It's a side effect of Orchid's disease. Ask your doctor. Orchid's disease? A childhood virus that swept through the Bajoran work camps during the occupation. Thousands of children didn't survive. I did, thanks to a bone marrow transplant from a sympathetic Cardassian woman. Her name is Cattell. When we get home, you can ask her yourself. And I apologize to the Seska actress for that horrible voice I used for her. Anyway, I'm going to take some liberty here, and I'm going to assume that this blood test was genetic and not just a blood typing test. Now, Seska is not what she appears to be, as many of you know, but her explanation attempt was really interesting, though. Blood cells are made by bone marrow. So if she got a bone marrow transplant from a Cardassian, she may well have blood that has Cardassian factors to it. Very sneaky. Now, there's more to this example I go into in another video, but it's a great bit of biology slipped in by the writers. Now, I've set things up here, so you're probably thinking genetic ancestry testing is awesome! Clear results, big implications. Unfortunately, biology is often more complex than that. And I'd like to highlight 3 challenges with interpretations. So the first may seem bizarre, but your genealogical ancestry, meaning your actual relatives in the past, may not be the same as your genetic ancestry. And in fact, we don't always expect them to be the same. Now, specifically, you may well have real ancestors far back from whom you inherited no DNA whatsoever. Now, let's look at why. Do you remember this figure? So at 6 generations back, you barely have any DNA from a single ancestor. The reason is partly because of the sheer number of ancestors you have that far back. So let me break this down further. This list shows how many ancestors you have back to 11 generations ago. Now that number, as you see, goes up pretty rapidly. The far right column tells you the percent that contributed at least some DNA to you. So you usually get at least something from ancestors up to 6 generations back. But as you start having hundreds or thousands of ancestors further back, there are some, and eventually lots, from whom you inherit literally nothing. Think of it a bit like splitting a pie. Splitting into 16 or 32 pieces, everyone still gets some, even if not much. But eventually, if you're splitting a pie into hundreds or thousands of pieces, the pieces get so small that some people literally don't get any. Their pieces would be less than a crumb. So again, if you know, for instance, that you have one East Asian or Native American or European ancestor more than 6 generations back, you may well have no DNA from them at all. That's my first point. The second point I want to emphasize is that the accuracy and precision varies a lot. Part of this has to do with the size of the DNA chunk. If it's a really, really tiny chunk, like shown here, the accuracy on where it comes from is not necessarily high. And that's because it's inferred using maybe just 1 or 2 DNA letters. So if 23andMe shows you having 0.1% ancestry from Poland or whatnot, it may be just wrong. Now, a related problem is how many samples are in the database that are used to infer ancestry. Now, these databases tend to have way, way more European samples than, say, Native American or Middle East or parts of Africa. And that's not just biases, it's an outcome of wealth differences of which customers bought the service and gave them their DNA samples. Unsurprisingly, way more European descent people than, say, Sub-Saharan Africa or Middle East people tended to have done this. And finally, this is a lead-in for our discussion on race. The unit of ancestry we use is really a funny one when you think about it. We talk about ancestry based on continents and geography. Now, of course, there's issues with migration, but that's not even what I'm going to talk about. Researchers are very thoughtful about migration patterns in these studies. There was a 2020 study that I'm going to talk about in just a moment of 1,000 fully sequenced genomes that sampled African, Native American, and Oceanian populations, and they specifically chose ones less likely to have been impacted by colonization. And then they used those to look at relationships. Now, in that study, they didn't, for example, use, a white man from Cape Town, South Africa, for example, but instead they used native people whenever they could. But fundamentally, does continental geography explain genetic variation well? I'll tell you in a minute, and that leads into the question of the meaning of race. So here in the United States, there are 5 quote-unquote races noted in the US Census. So white European American, black African American, et cetera, et cetera. Now you'll note they correlate with continents of origin too. And we hear these groupings all the time in casual conversations, in the news, and more. But I want to raise the question for you, how distinct are these races? Now, are 2 people who are in the same race category more similar to each other genetically than 2 people who are in different race categories? And if the answer is no, what does the category even mean? So there have been many studies of this over the years. This is from one of the oldest, from around 1987. They used mitochondrial DNA, which is a very, very small bit of your overall DNA. In this study, they found that on average, and that average part is important, 2 Europeans chosen at random differ at 0.23% of their mitochondrial DNA, or 23 letters from every 10,000 letters. So Europeans differed a tiny bit more from people in other categories on average, like Austronesian or East Asian. And again, note these are averages. Some pairs of Europeans differed from each other by more than they did to an East Asian. Now, this gets a lot more murky when other comparisons and categories get included. So for example, two Africans differ from each other on average by a lot more than a European does from an East Asian. Now that's just with a tiny bit of genetic data. So let's come back to this 2020 study I mentioned, which uses 1,000 whole genomes. It's actually 929, but we'll round up. First, they found there was literally no single diagnostic site in the whole genome. What that means is there's no case where, for example, a letter A means you're definitely European, and not having an A means you're definitely non-European. And in many cases, just like in that small scale study, they found greater similarity of some populations to groups on other continents than among groups on the same continent. This is especially true when Africa was included. For example, the Yoruba in Africa were much more genetically similar to Europeans than the Yoruba were to the neighboring Budi population. If you found the two most genetically different people in the world from each other, they're very likely both of African descent. So what does that say about race, and especially the single category of African? Well, here's another way of looking at it. These circles depict shared genetic variants. Green here is African, blue is East Asian, purple is European. So looking at this figure, how useful are these categories for describing the genetic variation? Now, you may be looking at all this and thinking, this doesn't make sense. What about skin color? Well, what about skin color? You may feel like, hey, I can tell when I see somebody. Now, it is true that skin color differences, even controlling for sun exposure, show more difference between continental groups than most individual genetic variants. So skin color, for example, is often accurate distinguishing someone of European versus African ancestry. But it's far from perfect. First, I want to stress skin color is a continuous trait. There is a range among people, again, even controlling for sun exposure, with someone in pretty much every intermediate state between the extremes. And some people would not fall into the group you'd think they would based on genetic ancestry. But I want to argue a second point, which is that skin color is an arbitrary criterion. Now, let me do this with an example. I'm going to make up new racial groupings, okay? Rather than using skin color, I'm going to say we should use height. And I'm going to say, we're going to split this up for male versus female. I'm going to say for men that every man above 5'10" is in group tall. Every man below 5'10" is in group short. You can probably look around this room, and for the majority of people, you can probably accurately place them into group tall or group short. Yeah, there's going to be a few borderline cases at 5'9.5" or whatnot, but especially with some practice, you'll probably be able to do it nearly perfectly. Then maybe you're thinking, that's arbitrary. Height doesn't mean anything biologically. Well, first, height is absolutely correlated with a suite of other biological differences, including geographic origin. So just Google it. Height has purported correlations with health measures, with even IQ and more. Maybe you even think that skin color has a stronger genetic basis than height does. Well, researchers have measured how much genetics versus environment affect each trait. For height, 80% of the variation observed is genetic. To illustrate this, there was a study published in 2018 in the journal Genetics that very accurately predicted height from genetic samples to within a couple of centimeters. For skin color, again controlling for sun exposure, studies estimate that it has between 55 and 83% of its variation genetic. So at best, skin color is just as genetic as height, and thus my proposed height race is at least as non-arbitrary as color race or continent race. Now I want to stress that identity or self-reported race often doesn't match genetic ancestry either. Now people often refer to their race based on culture or based on appearance. Now studies have found that lots of people who self-identify as black in the US have less African than European ancestry, just as an example. Another example, to be called Native American, you need to just be 1/16 Native American in ancestry. This figure on the right shows you what that looks like. So perceptions often don't match these ancestry tests. And I want to stress that I'm not implying that any of these perceptions or identities are wrong, since importantly, social challenges people face don't necessarily line up to the genetics either. Now finally, I want to stress that there are many missing groups who don't fit into any of these categories. Take me, for instance. I refer to myself as white because the census says peoples of Europe, the Middle East, or North Africa. Yeah, that fits, right? But when I call myself white, people very often tell me, well, you're not really white. And when I go to places that look like this, airports, I'm very quickly reminded that I'm not seen as white, and instead I'm seen as a threat. Now, some of you on the Star Trek cruise in 2020 may remember that our arrival in Puerto Rico got delayed because the port authority wanted to check my passport before anyone could get off the ship. Just my passport from the ship of over 3,000 people. Now, keep in mind, I'm a US citizen and I've never even lived outside the West, but I was perceived as a threat. And while that kind of experience may be frustrating for me, things are much harder for people who are Black or Latino in the United States who face distrust and suspicion literally every day just as they're going about their business. So summarizing, the continental racial groups most often used are very weakly correlated with genetics. There are no diagnostic sites, even in a massive study, and it's mostly naming and magnifying arbitrary or inconsistent differences in our minds. They don't tie consistently to actual ancestry, and there are many groups that are basically just left out. Overall, this is why many scholars have argued, and compellingly in my opinion, that race is a social construct. Now I want to emphasize that's not the same as saying there's no reality to it. Now based on the race that people are perceived to be, they often experience strong social inequalities. Now that is why it's considered insensitive to say things like, quote, I don't see race, because people from marginalized groups don't have the privilege to get to ignore their perceived race, and they're very often judged for it. So with all that, does Star Trek touch on race? The answer is definitely yes, both in the series that have been completed and in the current ones. So back to the original series, we had a whole episode where they made an arbitrary, albeit somewhat cringy, difference in people's appearances, and they showed prejudices and hate based on those differences. So Kirk's response looking at the two people in the episode was, I fail to see a significant difference. Now, if you think about it, that statement can easily apply to our own continental and skin color based races today. In another episode, Kirk yelled at an ensign who prejudged someone based on the racial appearance with, quote, leave any bigotry in your quarters. There's no room for it on the bridge. Deep Space Nine, of course, had the first black lead, and many episodes, especially this one, addressed challenges associated with race and how unfair they are. And Enterprise, you might remember Demons in Terra Prime, had a madman with many followers trying to promote purity of humans and demonizing interbreeding with other types. So yes, even the completed Trek series had a lot to say on race. So I've introduced here a lot of genetics. I've talked about genetic ancestry testing, both its promise and some of its limitations. And I've talked about the concept of race as used in humans. So let me close out with just a few bullets, just in case some of you are thinking about getting one of these personal genomic ancestry tests. Now I'm focusing on genetic ancestry tests, not tests for disease predisposition. I definitely do not recommend genetic disease tests using these straight-to-consumer testing companies. If you're concerned about a genetic predisposition to a disease, you should consult with a licensed genetic counselor. But on ancestry, I'd like to stress that, number one, these tests are recreational. So all the concerns I mentioned so far apply. And again, genetic ancestry is not the same as genealogical. Again, small fraction results are often inaccurate, and especially non-European assignments are sometimes not very accurate. Second, there are privacy issues to consider. People could experience discrimination based on genetic test results. Now, there's a law in the United States, the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, it's abbreviated as GINA, which limits some forms of discrimination, but some aspects are not covered by this law, like long-term care insurance. And that law could go away at any time. Third, it may give unwanted surprises. There was a survey sometime before 2017 that estimated almost 10% non-expected paternity. Whew! And many people had ancestry surprises. Though again, remember, genealogy is not the same as genetics. And finally, when you submit one of these tests, you're not only getting your DNA out there, but you're also effectively sharing the DNA of many of your relatives. Now, sometimes that can work out well. So for example, you may remember the Golden State Killer was caught based in part on data from distant relatives on genetic ancestry sites. But one can imagine nefarious uses may also be possible. So anyway, just some food for thought if you're considering these kinds of tests. Were you surprised that genetic and genealogical ancestry don't always match up? And have you ever tried one of these direct-to-consumer genetic tests? Let us know in the comments. My series, BioTrekkie Explains, is going to have to take a short hiatus. I apologize, getting really busy at work, but please like and subscribe so you find out when there's more videos, and thank you for tuning into BioTrekkie Explains. See you next time!